Now on to chapter 22, thinking about the aorist tense form, the second aorist, often called the harder aorist in terms of its sound, not harder in terms of difficulty of learning than the first aorist, but its sound because of the tense stem and the verbal root so identical, and that gives a bit of a harder sound as opposed to the first aorist that we'll see soon. The next chapter actually gives a tense formative sigma alpha saw. It gives it a softer sound. So second aorist, and we are thinking here about the specificity of verbal tense forms. You've seen this before, but present, active, imperfect, future, and now the aorist. There are two types of aorist. The second aorist we're looking at now, and then the first aorist in the next chapter. No difference in meaning between the first and second aorist, so immediately we can put our fears to rest. There's no difference in meaning, only in form, and you'll be able to pick them up pretty easily, and to distinguish the aorists from all other tense forms, and to distinguish the first and second aorist from one another. We've noted already that in the lexicon there are listings for the different tense forms of verbs, 6 for each. The present active, that's the actual lexical form, and then 5 that follow: future active, middle, aorist active, perfect middle passive, and aorist passive. Want to bring this up again, the master personal ending chart. This you have memorized by now, and you'll see these secondary tense forms with the aorist, because along with the imperfect that we just looked at in the previous chapter, it is a past tense form, generally speaking. English has the ed suffix, Greek has a prefix, an augment, and attaches to the stem of the imperfect or the aorist tense forms. The aorist is normally thought of as a past action, but not always, and we'll talk about that toward the end of our slide presentation here today. It always, though, has an undefined aspect to it. While imperfect is a continuous in the past, aorist is normally past, but an undefined aspect. It just happened. It's just basic vanilla. There it is. The action happened. And these both use secondary personal endings because they are generally considered past time. Components of the second aorist active have the augment, the aorist active tense stem, connecting vowel, and the secondary personal ending. Pretty basic there. And then the paradigm of the second aorist active, again, pretty basic. We've seen these secondary personal endings already in the imperfect, and now we see them here, ns, and then third singular is blank, or sometimes the nu is there, though it can be moved, it's sometimes there, men, te, n. Notice the first singular and third plural are the same. When you parse these, you'll want to put both down, first singular or third plural. So second aorist active indicative, first singular, third plural, that's elabon, from lambano, means I took or they took. How are we going to know what person and number elabon refers to? Well, context. We will find the subject of the verb in the context of the sentence. So same form, but context will help us to identify exactly who's doing this action. Components of the second aorist middle indicative, you got the augment again, the active tense stem, connecting vowel, and then middle or passive personal endings. Here we have main, saw, which contracts to u, the sigma drops out, the epsilon and omicron contracts to u. Main saw ta, metha, setha, and ta. Pretty basic then on the second aorist middle indicative. Again, remember the endings. Once you have memorized this chart, you will be able to read much more quickly and begin to identify verbs. Second aorist really goes pretty quickly. Its main way to recognize the second aorist. It's a bit more rare, but it has an augment. If you notice the augment, you know that you're in one of the past times, imperfect or second aorist or first aorist. And the second aorist has the secondary endings there, and it's going to be distinguished from the first aorist that we'll learn in the next chapter, because the first aorist, instead of a connecting vowel, has a tense formative, sigma alpha, and that will immediately distinguish it from the second aorist. So second aorist is learned in this order because, as Mounce notes, it's fairly similar to the imperfect. So we think imperfect and aorists with the augment signaling past time, secondary endings. What distinguishes imperfect from second aorist? The imperfect uses the present tense stem, and the second aorist uses the aorist tense stem. And you can see that here in the master verb chart. A couple of vocab ideas, and then I want to talk for a minute about exegesis of the aorist. Vocab apothnesko. The bridge here that I'm suggesting, thanatos, noun that you discovered in chapter 8, means death. Apothnesko, you can sort of hear that in there. I die. Artos, I see artos and I think of an art, a museum. There may be a little pastry bar in a museum if you've been to the Nelson Atkins Museum here in Kansas City, where Midwestern Seminary is. You may have eaten at their little bistro, which I highly suggest. Just a great time there. Or think of Panera Bread. Have you ever noticed so much art on the walls dealing with bread? Artos, bread. Sounds a bit silly, but sometimes the more creative you can get, the more easily a word is memorized. Ballo, ball, I throw, pretty basic there. Continue to work on your vocab and review it. You'll want to solidify words in your mind by reviewing. The more creative with word pictures that you can be, the more likely you'll remember these words. Finally, some ideas about exegesis of the aorist. Because it is an undefined aspect, the author or the speaker in discourse is just wanting to communicate that this happened, but there are some flexible nuances with the aorist, and context determines which of these comes up. These are noted in Mounce, but the ingressive aorist, it's called, deals with the beginning of that action. It's starting to happen. It's viewed holistically, but it's starting to happen. The gnomic aorist is proverbial. This is just something that always happens, and many of the proverbs are this kind of gnomic aorist in the Septuagint or the Greek Old Testament. The constative aorist, just constituting something, it's there. Proleptic aorist is looking forward. And Mounce notes the most famous, Romans 8:28, those whom he justified, he also glorified. In the aorist tense form, it's a completed action, but it's not in the past. It's looking forward. It's proleptic. Our glory is in the future. That is the second aorist, and we're now making progress in these various tense forms, and first aorist will be next.